My notes are being more difficult to pull up than usual. You guys are all here on a day like this, so you must really be interested in hearing about Mr. Isaac. So we of course, we're continuing our study of the genealogy of Jesus, going through the lineages as described in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, and kind of taking a look at these people. Why, if any, significance do they have? Why is this the genealogy that God chooses? What is the purpose of that? And we've talked about quite a few already. And one of the big overall arcs, of course, I'm trying to point out is that God had this plan way ahead of time. This was not this random thing that just happens in the New Testament. Suddenly God gets this great idea. Hey, let's put Jesus down on earth and we'll solve everything. This was way back in the garden. Here's a plan. The fall of man has happened. He tells the serpent, you've done this thing. You're going to have this conflict with mankind. He's going to crush your head. You're going to strike his heel. Jesus is pretty much implicated pretty strongly in there once you understand what Jesus is doing. And we see constant mentions of Jesus kind of sprinkled throughout this genealogy as we go through these people. We just finished, of course, talking about Abraham last week. What was Abraham told? By your seed, all nations of the earth are going to be blessed. Not just the Israelites, all nations, even ones that were not descended of Abraham. He says all nations are going to be blessed because of you, because of one particular person that's going to come from you. That is speaking about Jesus. And of course, we point out in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, Matthew makes a point to say that this Jesus, he is a descendant of both Abraham and David. And then he goes on to give his genealogy. But he points out those two people specifically, and we really talked about why Abraham, what's important about that. He's the great patriarch. If you were a Jew in Israel, you had to be able to line up your lineage with Abraham. You had to show you were one of the promise. And for prophecy to be fulfilled, Jesus would have to be a descendant of Abraham. Guess what? He was. That's the whole purpose of Matthew's account, really. Because he's not going all the way back to Adam like Luke is. Luke is more looking at, here, the Gentiles need to know about this guy too. Who are they going to draw themselves from? Well, it's not Abraham. Abraham's just another guy to a Gentile. He's nothing special. So he draws it all the way back to Adam and God, whereas Matthew seems to be directing his gospel toward the Israelites, toward those who were of the Jewish faith, who knew Abraham, who understood the significance of that. So it's nice to finally have Matthew and Luke both going together right now that we've gotten to Abraham, and now we're going to start Isaac this morning. It's going to be together for a while. It's going to be the same names. We're going to be pretty easy going through the study until we get after King David. It's going to split off, and we're going to have some interesting back and forth between Matthew and Luke. But we're a ways off from there. So like I said, I do want to start talking about Isaac this morning. Just kind of giving a preparatory contrast. When we talked about Abraham, the themes that we found describing Abraham was not only is he, the great patriarch that every Jew wants to tie themselves to, and that's a very important thing, but also the New Testament especially talks about his faith. That is what the New Testament talks about more than anything else. His genealogy, yes, that's important. How he's tied to Jesus, that is important. But his faith takes precedent beyond all of that. If you wanted to be a child of Abraham, we're told by Paul, it's not because of a bloodline, it's because you have the same faith that Abraham has. You act like your father Abraham, not like your father Satan, as he says to some. Or I believe that's Jesus in John 8 saying those things. But Paul says very similar things in Romans chapter 4, Galatians chapter 3. We read some of those. The Hebrew writer talks about Abraham a few times. We've gone through some of that. James chapter 2 talks about his faith and how his faith made him do something, as the Hebrew writer in Hebrews 11 says. But that's Abraham. He's the great patriarch. He's a man of faith. We come now to Isaac. Isaac is not unimportant. I can't say he's not, but he is not like the grand patriarch. He doesn't get as much, we would call it screen time if this was a movie. He doesn't get as much screen time. But he's the son of the promise. We know that Abraham had actually several kids. He had, of course, Ishmael, and then Isaac, and then he had several sons by Keturah later on toward the end of his life. So Isaac is not special just because he's a son of Abraham. A bunch of people were. But he is the son of promise. There was a miraculous instance with him that could not have happened. I mean, Sarah is 90 years old by the time Isaac is born. That's amazing, even in that time when people may still have a little bit longer lifespans than we do. But as we've gone through the generations from Shem down to Abraham, we've all noted, or at least I've noted for you all, that those years get really short much quicker. By the time where Shem lived 600 years, by the time we're getting to the generations right before Abraham, it's 1, maybe 200 years tops. That's it. We're not looking at long lifespans after that point. So Isaac is the son of promise. He's not talked about as much in great description as Abraham, but he does serve an important role symbolically as being the son of promise. A lot of times when Isaac is mentioned, it's in tandem with Abraham, especially when they're talked about in the New Testament. But there are a couple things that we'll talk about just specifically to Isaac. So I'm going to do what I did similarly to Abraham when we talked about Abraham. I'm going to just kind of summarize some of the things he does in Genesis. I'm not going to read through all of it. I encouraged you last week to go ahead and do so yourself. But I'm just going to give some short summary notes. If you want to stop me and want to talk about something in a specific chapter, go ahead and stop me. Let me know. But I'm hoping to get through all of Isaac. Hopefully we can talk about him a little bit in places other than Genesis before we're done this morning. So Isaac, of course, was the son of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was 100 years old. Sarah was 90 years old when Isaac was born. We see this in Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 7. When we get to Genesis chapter 22, Isaac is, we have this pretty well-known story. God has asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham is fully willing to go through with this, and God stops him at the last minute. And there's a lot of recounting about this story in the New Testament, talking about how Abraham was fully invested in following God's commands. He was a man of faith. This is one of the prime areas where Abraham was showing his faith, and Isaac just happened. I'm not going to say just happened because that makes it sound coincidental. It's not. It's part of the plan. But he is going to go through with it, even though he's been told by God, this is your son of promise, where all these great nations are going to come from. And he's trying to figure out, well, how's this going to work? If I sacrifice Isaac, how is this going to work? And in Hebrews 11, the Hebrew writer tells us a little bit of what may have been Abraham's mindset, is that he had sacrificed Isaac, and he was rationalizing that God could bring Isaac back from the dead. What faith? Because nowhere in the Bible up to that point have we seen a resurrection. The first resurrection we see in the Bible at all is in Elijah's time, way past this point. But whether or not this had ever happened before, we're not privy to it if it had. But if it hasn't, Abraham is rationalizing that God can do something that has never been done before. That's a great act of faith. Go ahead, James. Yeah, there's so much parallelism going, and the Bible, mentions it, but it's pretty easy for us to see it and say, hey, this seems familiar. A father sacrificing his son is a theme we know in the New Testament. We've kind of talked about this when we started this study. The whole story of the Bible is man's reconciliation with God. That's the Bible in a nutshell. How does this happen? And it's by the sacrifice of Jesus. And we see a very similar instance of this between Abraham and his son Isaac. God is not choosing this act randomly. This is obviously something he's putting in seed for people generations later to see, oh, this thing that Abraham did with Isaac, this is basically what's happening with us now. There's a lot more we're probably going to say about that, so we won't get too deep into it. But of course, Isaac comes away from this instance in Genesis chapter 22 completely unharmed. He's not hurt or anything. He's not ended up being sacrificed. But in Abraham's mind, he had already done it. He had already made up his mind to follow after God. Jeff, go ahead.
We'll talk for a second about the relationship of love and logic. Not to say that love is illogical, but we must not judge love by logic. In other words, the overriding principle should be love. So in this particular, Jesus tells a story about the man who owned a vineyard. He sent servants to receive from the workers the part of the crop that was his, and they wouldn't give it to him. So he said, I'll send my son. Now that's not logical. Most of us would say, no, he's already killed some of the servants. I'm not going to send my son. But love is more dominant than logic. There's a lot of things that we could run into as Christians in which people say, well, that doesn't make sense to do that. Sometimes you do things because it's right. You help somebody who it may seem like you're burning money or pouring money down the drain, so to speak, by helping this person. But there are times when that is the right thing to do because of love. And so in Isaac's case, God said, go to the mountain and offer your son Isaac. Well, for what purpose? Why? You can't understand that. The point I'm getting at is that sometimes we do things out of love for others. And I'm not saying that reason has nothing to do with it. I'm just saying you cannot reject love for reason.
I mean,
What you're doing is you're rejecting God's command for us to love others over your understanding of it. And it doesn't matter if you understand or not. If it is God's command, we love our brethren, we love others as we can. Yes, we take care of our family, I'm not talking about that. But it doesn't always have to make sense to us for it to be the right thing to do.
and I think if you take God and you say, well, let's take love out of it. Let's only have logic, if you will, if that's the terminology we want to say. If God was doing everything the way that it should have been done as far as we deserve, none of us need to be here right now. I mean, that's the short of it. That's the end of the story. And I love that parable you bring up, because this is exactly what God did. Is He sent servants. He sent His prophets who were telling people, hey, this is what you need to be doing. You're doing wrong. Follow after the Lord. Do what He has commanded. How many generations of prophets were sent? A whole Old Testament, basically. We'll just wrap it up like the entirety of the Old Testament. There are people constantly trying to go to the Israelites, most of those cases, saying, this is what you need to do. This is how you need to serve the Lord. And half the time being completely rejected. And then even the other half where they sort of go along with it, it's only sort of, you've seen the messiness of that when we talked about Elijah and Elisha in our last study. It's not great. And, in that parable, they beat the servants. And then He says, well, I'm going to send my son. Now, if we think about the status of it, even in that parable, but if we think of the status of God, He's the king. He's the Almighty. He sends His son. That son's gotten some authority here. I'm sending someone who is of utmost importance to make sure this gets done. So I don't even see that as necessarily logical, but they take it a step further and they kill Him. They're having none of it. But in God's case, that's actually the plan here. It's one of those things we'll never quite truly understand, I think, is the depth of God's love and His patience for us, because we don't have that patience. I know I don't always with my kids. I don't know how He is able to do that. It's a love that I will hopefully understand one day, but I'm still working on it. Continuing on with our summations in Genesis here, when we skip to Genesis 24, we see Abraham. He sends his chief servant to go to the land of Abraham's forefathers to bring back a wife for Isaac. Now, when I say that, I don't mean back to Ur. I mean back to the area of Haran, where his relatives who had gone with him out of Ur had ended up settling. So we're not talking about all the way back to what would be modern-day Iraq. We're talking about modern-day Syria area there up north. So the chief servant, he goes up to bring back a wife for Isaac, because Abraham, his concern is that Isaac is either going to go back to a place like Ur and not return, or go to a place like Haran and not return. So he's not sending Isaac in this case. He's sending his chief servant. But he also doesn't want Isaac to marry a wife of the Canaanites. Now, why would that be? What would be a problem with Isaac marrying one of the local Canaanites?
Just like throughout after his time and time before after that, these men are marrying women that worship other gods.
Yeah, almost, I'm not going to say without exception because there are exceptions, but a lot of the times when they marry one of the local Canaanites, these Canaanite groups, these tribes, have idolatrous worship. And almost every time they bring it with them. And we've talked about this with Ahab, even though he was a pretty bad king probably already. One of the things that happens is when he marries Jezebel, the daughter of Sidon, that brings Baal worship in, just floods Israel. They build a temple to Baal in Samaria. It's basically state-sponsored worship. And it never really goes away until the captivity. I mean, Jehu does a few things to kind of destroy stuff, but it never really leaves. It is in the cultural zeitgeist. It's not leaving until the captivity. And that's just one marriage. That's one example. And it ruins an entire nation. There were other problems too, but that certainly sealed it. A lot of times, Solomon is another example. He marries all these wives, part of his diplomacy. What do? They pull his heart away from God toward other gods. They bring their gods with them. This is the problem. It's not, and God had warned them about this specifically because of that reason. When he told the Israelites, don't go marrying the local Canaanite populations because they are going to turn your heart away from God. That was the warning. Now, there are exceptions. We'll actually talk about them. Ruth, Rahab, these are some examples that we're going to talk about where there was something different about them. Namely, they wanted to serve God and not the idols that they had known. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. But that's the concern that Abraham has regarding a wife for Isaac. Jeff, you had your hand up. I'll give you a chance to get in.
You're right in all that you said, but it goes even deeper than that. The quality that Sarah is noted for in 1 Peter 3 is that she submitted to Abraham, calling him Lord. So there was already in Abraham's family a willingness to leave. They left Ur to go to Haran. Okay, so there was always already a willingness to leave the past culture, religions behind. And while there was some idolatry in Laban and probably in the family in Haran, so I wouldn't say it's totally idolatry. It's just the willingness for the wife to submit to the husband and to, instead of fighting with him, Solomon's wives fought with him and it influenced him.
And he was outnumbered.
It was the idea, not just that they had idolatrous upbringing, but that they were going to treat their marriage as a conflict and as a vie for control. And a lot of husbands and wives do that today. And, it's all about who can control the circumstance. And while the husband has a lot of muscle, the wife has other powers and other abilities that in our present culture make them a lot of times more dominant than the man. And so Sarah's quality, and maybe it was a quality in that family or that was not unknown to that family, to be willing to accept the future. It's for Abraham's family and the patriarchs, it was unknown. They were traveling. They did not receive the land in their lifetime. And so she had to be able to fit into that plan.
Sure. And I think we'll have more to talk about when we get to talking about people like Boaz. I think that we'll have a lot more to talk about when we get to it. Because it's nice to have a good example to go along with it, but I'm also not trying to get to it far ahead. Go ahead, James.
Well, it goes without saying that it's apparent to me that God takes marriage very serious.
Yes.
Okay, so I am of the understanding that the church is the bride of Christ, and that means and being that is taken serious. Also, we members of the body of Christ are the church. So God and Jesus have a very special relationship with us, and just as serious as that part of it is, it has always been serious with God, who is descendants of Esau or the descendants of Ishmael, even though they have Abraham as the same grandfather or whatever. So what I was trying to get at is that being that the church, we, us, are the body of Christ, are members of the body of Christ, and that the church itself is the bride of Christ. God has always been consistent with making sure that, trying to explain to the Jews as time was going on, don't marry people from other tribes that practice other religions, and how serious religion is that we are practicing is important to him.
I have nothing to add to that. Yeah, that's, and again, when we start talking about people like Boaz and Ruth, and we're going to talk about what the difference is there. That actually will play a very interesting dynamic when we talk about people like David, because David is a descendant of a Moabite, and you're like, oh, well, hey, hold on a second, that doesn't seem right. But because she was willing to say, I'm not wanting to bring these gods with me, I'm willing to change, and I want to be in this marriage, to God, basically. And this is my personal opinion. I don't think it's an outlandish one. I think God uses our marriages that we have here on earth to help us understand what our relationship to him is supposed to be. I mean, there's, we could talk about, what are other reasons or what other examples could be used. I think that's a very easy way for us to learn, how do I need to be one with God? The same way a husband and wife are one. And the Bible uses that analogy over and over and over again. It's not like, oh, it just happens to work out to be like this. This is God's plan. He designed it to be like that. This is not chance or randomness or things just working out just so. This is God making it just that way. This is not just a nice occurrence. This is the plan. This is the point. Getting back to Genesis 24, we do know that, of course, Rebekah returns with this chief servant. There's a lot more to that story. I am giving a summation here. We do know in that chapter 24, verse, I think it's 67, that we have some indication from Isaac had probably taken the death of his mother Sarah very hard, because it talks about, when Rebekah returned, he had been comforted concerning the death of his mother. So it kind of gives us this little nugget of information that kind of shows us that probably Sarah was a really great mom too. I've kind of talked about before how Abraham was a really good father because he cares about his children. He cares about Ishmael, even though Ishmael is not the son of promise. When he's being told to send them away, he's concerned about that. He doesn't want to lose his son. He doesn't know what's going to happen when he sends them away. And it's God's promise to him that eventually makes Abraham feel, okay, God's going to take care of him. I'm going to trust in God in this. There's another instance of faith. But he cared about his sons, not just Isaac. And then I think we could say maybe the same thing for Sarah too. She was probably a great mom, but she can't be around forever. She was 90 years old already. So it's kind of one of those interesting little information bits that we can derive a lot of pretty interesting information from. When we get to Genesis 25, we're told that Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Rebekah, there are some problems, but eventually she does give birth to twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau, as James mentioned, was technically the older one, not by much, but he is the older of the twins. Isaac was 60 years old when Esau and Jacob were born. So he's not 100 like Abraham was, but if you think about becoming a father for the first time at 60, to us that seems pretty old. And I don't think that would have been too different in that time either. Genesis 26, verses 1 through 11, there's a famine. Isaac goes to the area of Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, which there's a really similar situations that happens there with him and his wife, and the situation that Abraham had with Abimelech and Sarah. This whole thing about trying to take their wife as his own wife, and then them saying it's a sister. We've talked about this story before. It's not exactly clear if this is the same Abimelech or a descendant of the Abimelech from Abraham. I tend to think because of the amount of time that's passed, it's probably a descendant. Maybe Abimelech was more of a title, or, like you give your same son Abimelech the second or something like that. There are some that say, oh, no, it's probably the same person, but time-wise to me, that's pushing it, unless Abimelech was really, really young when he ran into Abraham, and then he's really, really old when he runs into Isaac. That seems like a stretch even to me. So I think it's a descendant, but we're not told exactly. But we have a little bit of conflict there. So I'm just mentioning that. I don't really have much more to say about that story. In Genesis 26, verses 12 through 33, we see that Isaac plants crops and reaps 100-fold of his crop, which I think this may be the first instance, except for maybe, no, this is the first instance, at least in this genealogy, where someone has planted crops in a particular spot, and they weren't being nomadic for at least a time. Isaac was of nomadic. He did move around, but here we see him actually literally put down roots because he plants some harvest here, and he reaps from it. So it's an interesting case. We don't really see that happen very often until the conquering of Canaan land by the Israelites later on, or I guess maybe there's some mentions of it when they're in Egypt. I can't remember for sure, but there's not a lot of that. It's kind of an oddity. Anyway, the Philistines, they become a little envious. They stop up the wells that Abraham had dug. There's some more conflict between Isaac and Abimelech, but they kind of leave on good terms, sort of. It's contentious, but they separate on decent terms. By the time we get to verse 34 and 35, we see that Esau has 2 wives, and they are a source of grief for Isaac and Rebekah, which is how it's described, which sounds really too bad. We know that they're Canaanite. Did their influence of potential idolatry that they brought in affect Esau and his descendants? It's not a far stretch with all the things we've talked about. But they were not big fans of Esau's wives. When we get to Genesis 27, Isaac is he's old. He's getting toward the end of his life, and he can't really see very well. And Isaac is basically preparing to give his blessing to his sons. He's kind of ready to give his last. We say his last words. He actually lives for a little while after this, but he's going to kind of give his last things that he needs done, his blessings to his sons. And so it notes for us in the scriptures that Isaac seemed to favor Esau, while Rebekah seemed to favor Jacob. That might be, a good warning against favoritism of your children, because it creates these rifts naturally. So we have, and that's noted in Genesis 25:28 for those of you who are taking notes on that. Rebekah, she overhears Isaac, and she conspires with Jacob to have Jacob take the blessing of Esau from Isaac, and Jacob, with some support from Rebekah, successfully deceives Isaac and steals the blessing that was supposed to be for Esau. This is a pretty well-known story. If you haven't reviewed it, go back and do so. There's probably a lot more that we could talk about, but again, I'm trying to get through as quick as I can. When we get to verses 30 through 40, Esau returns, and he and Isaac soon realize what's happened. So Esau begs Isaac to bless him also. And Isaac does bless Esau, but it's a much lesser blessing in comparison. And then when we get to verses 41, going to chapter 28, verse 9, Rebekah is fearful that Esau is going to kill Jacob, and that may be his intention. And we know that Esau is a man of hunting. This is something he could do. She's fearful for Jacob's life, concerning the stolen birthright and blessing, all these things that have gone down. So Rebekah tells Isaac that she's disgusted with Esau's, I think it specifically says they're Hittite wives. The details on Esau's wives are kind of all over the place sometimes, so I'm not trying to nail that down. That's a whole nother study. But she's had it up. She's fed up with Esau's wives, so she says, let's go send Jacob up to our relatives up north to basically find a wife. That's the reason she's sending him off, but also she's afraid Esau's going to kill him. So she didn't say that, but she says she wants not another Canaanite woman to be in the house, basically. So Isaac blesses Jacob, sends him on his way. When Esau learns of this, and he hears the story about how his wives are an issue to his parents, he goes to Ishmael and marries the daughter of Ishmael. So he has a third wife, which seems like, hey, maybe that doesn't really solve the problem, but I think Esau is trying to put a Band-Aid on a wound that's much too big. Now, why does this fix anything? I don't really understand Esau's logic here, except for maybe he's trying to appease his parents a little bit. Oh, here's a relative, because Ishmael is a descendant of Abraham. Let me try to patch things up in this way. It doesn't really do that, obviously, but that is an interesting turn. And it's really I think it's mentioned there more for the genealogical side of things. The story of Esau's descendants is actually pretty well documented throughout Scripture. And I think, this is just an inclusion to mention that one of Ishmael's descendants is also in the line of Esau. Kind of an interesting thing. Isaac isn't really talked about much in Scripture after this point. The narrative of Genesis really focuses on Jacob, him leaving, going up to meet Laban and all the things that he does up there, and then him leaving Laban. But we do have Isaac's death mentioned in Genesis chapter 35, verses 27 through 29. Isaac dies of the age of 180 years old. He's buried by his sons Esau and Jacob. Of course, Jacob by this time, he's now got the name Israel. We'll talk about that name change more when we talk about Jacob, probably next week. And that's Isaac's life. Again, not nearly as long as Abraham's. Abraham's seems to take up a lot more of Genesis for reasons. I mean, that makes sense. But a lot of things are going on with Isaac. He's the son of the promise. He's the son of Abraham. And now he's trying to navigate his own two sons, and how are they going to play into God's plan here? And probably doesn't go the way that he thought it would. I think if I'm stepping into Isaac's shoes, in my mind, I would think, well, Esau is the oldest. Naturally, he must be the one to get the greater blessing, but it's apparently God's will that no, Jacob received the greater blessing. Jacob received the birthright of the eldest son. So when we see these things happening, this is God's will that this happens. And I think we'll understand as we go through the history of these two. Obviously, Israel had its issues, but Edom, the descendants of Esau, much greater issues. I mean, the idolatry, it's not even a question of whether they're going to serve God or not. They just don't. I think, again, that is probably the influence. Maybe at the very beginning, Esau marrying these wives who were, as far as we can tell, not necessarily God-serving people. So, very interesting detail, I think, that is mentioned there. I don't think it's mentioned just offhand. This is why things go the way they do. Comments, questions about anything we've talked about in Genesis concerning Isaac before we turn to the New Testament? Go ahead, Jeff.
Talk about Esau and Jacob and Ishmael and Isaac. It's interesting, we can clearly see problems more with Esau. People are quick to say, and it's true, that Jacob was no saint.
No.
Jacob was certainly not perfect, and he supplanted his brother and deceived his father in terrible things. It also says in Hebrews that Esau was a man who sought repentance and couldn't find it, and so that's a problem. What God is telling us is don't look at the natural order of things and think that's the way it has to go. Look deeper than that. And what I would say about Jacob and also Isaac is that they did ultimately do God's will. They were faithful patriarchs. Now Esau was blessed, but it's interesting that even as it talks about Isaac here, God appears to Isaac and says that I'm going to bless you, and in your seed all families will be blessed because of the faith of your father Abraham. Abraham is the keystone.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, I'm not saying that Isaac wasn't faithful. He was maybe not as faithful as Abraham, because Abraham is the example for us. And what we need to do is we need to look deeper. Not just the oldest gets the blessing all the time. The one that seems according to the order of things. Look deeper than that, because it is God's will. And you don't have to be perfect to be faithful. This is what Jacob and
Yeah, and I think pretty much any person in the Bible who gets any amount of detail, we're going to see those faults. And I think that's not to say like, oh, these people are no good. Why would God choose these people? It's to show that us with our faults, we can still find ways to be faithful to God. We can still follow an example. I mean, when we studied Abraham a couple years ago or so in depth, there were a lot of things that you're kind of questionable. Like, Abraham, are you sure about that? Is that the way we want to go? But even in his times of trial, he goes and he looks to God, and God's like, oh, I'm going to make it all right. And he tells Abraham, you don't understand how this is going to work, but I'm going to make it work. And that's the thing about the faith is it's not a blind faith, I think, like people talk about, because we have so much history, so many examples of where God always pulls through. It's not a question of is God going to do it, it's how is he going to do it. I don't necessarily know how he's going to make something happen. I just know he's going to make it work. May not be the way I think it should happen or the way I want it to happen, but maybe God's going to do it in a way that I didn't think about. Probably. Sometimes we ask God for things in prayer, and we think, God, please do this for us. And we expect him to do it, and we expect him to do it this way and in this time frame. And when it doesn't come in that time frame, we think, well, God's abandoned us. How long do you think Abraham prayed to God concerning his descendants? He was 100 years old by the time Isaac was born. That's a long time to wait. And by all accounts, and the scripture mentions this over and over, they were well past the age of having children. There's no physical way that Abraham and Sarah should have been able to have this son Isaac. That shouldn't have been possible. God makes it possible way later down the line. I mean, Abraham has been talking to God about this issue for a long time. And you go through Genesis, he's constantly thinking about this. He even says, my current heir right now is a servant from Damascus. Not even a blood heir. And then God says, it's going to work. There's going to be this great promise. You just don't see it yet. Well, I guess we're not going to get to the New Testament talking about Isaac. That bell is rung on me. So I guess that's a good place to stop anyway. So I don't want to stop midway through something. So next week, I do want to talk about Isaac. He is mentioned in the New Testament also, just like Abraham. Not nearly as much, and oftentimes when he's mentioned, it's like, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We get a lot of those instances. So we're not going to go into every single one of those, but there are a few places I do want to talk about. We might talk about a little bit of him in Romans chapter 9 and Galatians chapter 4. And then we'll probably go back to Hebrews 11 a little bit, talking about Isaac, because he is mentioned there, as well as James chapter 2. Because Isaac is not unimportant in those scenarios. So we'll go back and talk about those chapters a little bit, but focusing more on Isaac rather than Abraham in those instances. So that probably won't take us that long. I still think we'll start Jacob next week. So we'll talk about those at the beginning of next week with Isaac in the New Testament, and then we'll move on to talk about Jacob, later called Israel, who is next in the lineage. So basically, if you want to read ahead, because again, I'll just be doing a lot of summation just because there's so much about these guys. You might want to read up on Genesis 25, Genesis 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. Let's see, how far do we want to go? There's a lot more about Jacob. He basically goes through 46. So start 29, go to 46 if you want to read ahead. That sounds like a lot, but it's pretty quick reading. That'll kind of give you a summation of the life of Jacob. There are some parts that we'll skip and then we'll come back to when we get to later generations, as I've kind of done throughout. But again, we'll also want to talk about Jacob and how he is used in the New Testament as well. I think Jacob will take a bit longer than Isaac. There's just more talked about him in Scripture. So we may spend 2 or 3 weeks on Jacob, but we'll wrap up Isaac next week. So I'm going to stop there. That's a good spot. And then we'll continue on with the study. Thank you.